Ladies and gentlemen, there are at least two major fallacies that need to be understood if we're to overcome the arguments of containment, coexistence, accommodation, and ultimate merger with world communism. First of all, the premise behind these arguments is wrong. And you know you can't do much with a piece of logic if you start out with a faulty premise. The premise underlying the grand design is this. If all-out war should develop between major powers today, well, stop right there because we've already passed it. Back up all the way to the very first word, if. If. Ladies and gentlemen, when are we going to get it through our heads that all-out war is being waged against us right now and has been for a long time? And by all-out war, I mean total war, not just military war. We're so used to thinking in terms of the old-fashioned concepts of warfare in which the primary weapons were guns and bombs. We failed to realize that for the first time in history, we're facing an enemy that has mastered the concept of total warfare. World War III that rages around us right now is a political war, an economic war, a psychological war, a spiritual war, and a military war. But the military aspect is the least important of all. The only way that military strategy plays a role in the communist blueprint is in the form of guerrilla tactics aimed at creating internal chaos and anarchy, to create the kind of conditions conducive for the quick seizure of power centers by a small group of organized and well-trained revolutionaries. That's the only kind of military strategy you'll find in the communist manuals, whether written by Lenin, Mao Zedong, or Che Guevara. And even this kind of limited military activity could never succeed without the simultaneous waging of non-military war. The communist guerrilla bands wouldn't stand a chance of succeeding in most countries without other communists operating secretly among the people to create the appearance of popular support, operating within the communications media to generate propaganda, and operating inside the government itself to create the necessary corruption, bickering, and apparent inefficiency to prevent that government from moving strongly against the guerrilla groups. In Cuba, for instance, almost everyone remembers that when Batista fled the country, an army of over 45,000 soldiers surrendered without a fight to only about 1,800 revolutionaries under Castro. But very few people were aware that the general who surrendered these forces was himself a member of the Communist Party in Cuba, a perfect example of the non-military strategy of infiltration and treason producing an apparent military victory. The favorite weapons of communist conquest are not engines of mass destruction in the hands of soldiers wearing a recognizable uniform. They are instead propaganda, the slanted view of history, the preaching of hatred to incite civil disorder, the tactics of internal subversion, treason, blackmail, the smear, political assassination, all committed by soldiers who wear no uniform and who claim to be loyal citizens of the target country marked for conquest from within. This is how communism has spread across the globe, not with invading armies or bombs, and it's extremely unlikely that they'd abandon this non-military strategy, which has been so effective for them right at the zenith of their success. Now, without a doubt, the bomb is the most powerful weapon in the communist arsenal, but it's as a psychological weapon, not as a military one. The Soviets have gained more by using the bomb as a psychological weapon than they ever could have using it as a military weapon. Under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation, we've accepted concessions, compromises, and defeats one after another, which would have been unthinkable without that specter of a giant mushroom cloud fixed deep in our subconscious. As a matter of fact, the bomb, as a psychological weapon, is being dropped on the American people every single day. Movies such as On the Beach, 7 Days in May, Dr. Strangelove, Failsafe, Planet of the Apes. These well-produced and entertaining movies have done really a professional job of strengthening, subconsciously at least, the premise of the grand design. Motion pictures, of course, aren't the only source of this conditioning of the public mind. Radio, TV, books, magazines, and newspapers have all played more than their part. The message that has more or less been drummed into our heads follows the pattern pretty well presented in this illustrated brochure entitled Let There Be a World, written by Felix Greene. Greene is well known in ultra-leftist circles as an importer of propaganda film from Red China, and for his lectures and motion pictures extolling the virtues of life under communism in Asia. And by the way, I picked this up not too long ago at the Communist Bookstore in Los Angeles, the Progressive Bookshop it's called. Every once in a while I browse around in there just to find out what the progressives and the intellectuals are reading nowadays. And this is a classic example. Page after page of beautifully reproduced photographs, all depicting in minute detail the horrors of nuclear war and the beauties of disarmament and peace. Just take a look at a few of these. And naturally, just for openers, we see here in the beginning the fireball and the mushroom cloud. And then the charred bodies at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Grim reminders of the pain and the suffering of any war, but particularly of nuclear war. And then, for those of us with weak imaginations, we're shown what could happen to our cities. According to this map, if one of the super bombs were dropped on Manhattan Island, we could cross off everything clear out to Bridgeport, Connecticut, and fallout would take care of the rest, probably clear to California. And speaking of fallout, they have a special section here just for the ladies. Preserved in jars of formaldehyde, these are the grotesque remains after autopsy of tiny infants, stillborn and deformed, supposedly as a result of radioactive fallout. Now, what woman can look at these, or what man for that matter, without some kind of a lasting emotional reaction against even the mere thought of risking nuclear war? Well, here, rather graphically presented, is what at least is supposedly the only way that we can prevent this from happening to us. Disarmament, of course. And finally, back here at the very end, the appeal to the heartstrings. Let there be a world. It's really quite well done, I think. You have to give these people credit for knowing how to merchandise an idea. By the way, these are generally the same people who like to label anti-communists as being fright peddlers. Well, with regard to this particular book, I'm not saying that these pictures are phony or that the devastating effects of nuclear war have been exaggerated to the public for propaganda purposes, although there's now a great deal of evidence to support both of these contentions, but that's not the point. The point is that the motion picture producers, the TV commentators, and the publishers who are so creative in their ability to convey to us all the horrors of death under a nuclear bomb, for some reason, never get around to portraying the fact that there are other horrible ways to die. We're shown the mushroom cloud, but not the mass graves or the torture devices that exist behind the iron and bamboo curtains. We're shown the charred bodies at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but not the emaciated bodies of the living dead in Soviet concentration camps, or the mutilated corpses of innocent civilians hacked to pieces by communist terrorists in one country after another. It's not that there aren't pictures like this. It's just that we're seldom allowed to see them or be reminded of them through the accepted channels of mass communication. Now, here are just two examples out of many that could be offered. Two documents that have been readily available for a long time. They contain material which almost has been totally denied to the American people. The first is a government pamphlet entitled Lest We Forget, a pictorial summary of communism in action. It consists primarily of photographs smuggled out of Eastern Europe, providing documentary proof of communist atrocities committed in those lands in order to liquidate anti-communist opposition and to terrorize the people into submission. Now, there's no professional touch here, but the pictures still tell the story. We have the mass graves, the soundproof torture chambers, and the, well, I guess you'd say they would be the pitiful victims of a deliberate program of mass starvation. You know, it's actually hard to believe that these children, even down to age 2, were starved in this fashion in communist forced labor camps. Well, now the other example is this pamphlet entitled On the Morning of March 15th, and it consists of photographs and factual descriptions of the results of a communist terrorist raid in northern Angola on the morning of March 15, 1961. Over 200 Europeans and 300 Africans were murdered on that one day alone. Over 50 widely separated places along a 400-mile front were attacked almost simultaneously. In most places, every man, woman, child, and infant, every living creature, even the cats and the dogs, were killed in the most brutal and sadistic manner imaginable. Now, here are some of the less nauseating photographs, which hardly need description. You know, seeing that picture of the infant in the bassinet reminds me of one account which, forgive me, ladies, I must read, even though it sickens me to do so. A group of some 400 terrorists attacked the experimental farm at Mabridge. One of the few survivors of this attack, Manuel Lourenco Alves, relates what happened. The assault began at 6 in the morning, and all the houses on the farm, whether they belonged to Europeans, Africans, or mulattoes, were attacked simultaneously. The women were dragged out of their houses together with their children. In front of the mothers, the terrorists then proceeded to cut off the legs and arms of the children, and then started to play a grotesque game of football with the twitching bodies. The women and girls were then led away, stripped, raped, and cut up. Ladies and gentlemen, I've discussed these scenes and shown these pictures, not because of any desire to be sensational, believe me, but merely to help balance the scales of our judgment, to emphasize the almost forgotten fact nowadays that there are other horrible ways to die. Ways, as a matter of fact, that make the instant flash of a nuclear bomb seem merciful by comparison. And keep in mind that these other horrible ways to die are not the result of an event that happened almost a quarter of a century ago. We're talking about events that are happening right now to thousands of helpless human beings somewhere every day, millions every year. And we're not examining the unfortunate byproduct of an effort to bring an end to a long and bloody war. These incredible acts of brutality are the deliberate, premeditated works of men whose sole purpose is the destruction of human life and human values. But we're so saturated with peace propaganda and the specter of the mushroom cloud that we seldom have occasion to ponder these facts. And because of this one-sided exposure, millions of Americans have been conditioned, without their even knowing it, to fear the horror of nuclear war far more than they fear the terror of a communist peace. The communists have been winning this war because they've mastered the art of total warfare, while we've been conditioned to cower in fearful expectation of a war limited only to weapons of mass destruction. And so, the premise of the grand design starts right off with a faulty assumption. Instead of wondering what might happen if all-out war should develop, we must wake up to the fact that we are in an all-out war right now for our very survival. And instead of allowing ourselves to become afflicted with a nuclear war fixation, we must recognize that because communist strategy is what it is, the chances of this war ever involving an exchange of nuclear warheads is so remote as to be almost incalculable in the overall equation. But that isn't all that's wrong with the grand design. Another fallacy that needs to be exposed once and for all is the absurd conclusion that victory is impossible. Ladies and gentlemen, victory not only is possible, it's inevitable. Let me repeat that because it's so important. If you remember nothing else I've said, remember this. Victory not only is possible, it is inevitable. The only question is, for which side? It's inconceivable that the forces of freedom and the forces of slavery can coexist side by side indefinitely. One or the other is going to triumph in our lifetime. And if you want to satisfy your curiosity as to which side it's going to be, all you have to do is take a piece of paper and a pencil and a graph paper and mark off one side with the year starting 1945. On the other side, using whatever measure you wish, mark the relative level of prestige, power, and influence of the United States and of world communism. Chart the progress through the years right up to the present, and I think you'll find the resulting bar graph to be highly instructive. With hardly any deviation in the line, the power of world communism has been moving steadily upward, while that of the United States has been moving and sinking from one new depth to another. Take a ruler, then, and project both of these lines into the future, and you can see in very graphic form that unless there are some drastic changes in U.S. foreign policy, a policy that's been followed consistently by all administrations and both political parties since 1945, we are going to lose. It's as simple as that. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not a prophet of doom. I'm not saying that we're going to lose. I'm saying only that in order for us to have any chance to win, we must first wake up to the reality of that grand design that is U.S. foreign policy, and then we must set about to change it. And that, of course, leads us to the third and final question: change it to what? Now, ladies and gentlemen, you better hang on tight for this next part, because I know from experience that the ground ahead gets pretty rough in places. Some of you are going to be shocked, and the rest probably scared right out of your wits, because I'm going to propose my own grand design. I call it the grand design for victory, and it's not for the faint-hearted. Step one in my grand design for victory is the premise that we must be captains of our own ship. We must restore our military, economic, and political independence from the strangling entanglements of that budding world government called the United Nations. Instead of phasing out our best weapons, we should phase out all disarmament programs and those who propose them. As we should have learned at Pearl Harbor, disarmed and militarily unprepared nations are far more apt to become involved in war than those fully prepared to strike back. The best way to preserve the peace is to be prepared for war. And the best way to end the arms race is to move so far out in front that it ceases even to be a race. Now, instead of seeking ways to water down our principles and our traditions to the point where they can be accepted and merged with those of the majority of the world, we should be striving actually to improve and upgrade our American way of life even beyond present standards. And then let the rest of the world follow our example if they so wish. With regard to world communism, we must face up to the reality that whether we admit it or not, and whether we like it or not, we are now engaged in World War III, a total war in which the stakes are nothing less than our lives and our freedoms. And in this war, our goal must not be containment of or coexistence with communism. It must be victory over communism in order for us even to survive. It's not that we want it that way. It's just that we have no other choice. Now, before you nod in agreement with this goal of victory over communism, let me clarify just what that means. I'm not thinking in terms of those empty phrases and platitudes. that so often fall from the lips of politicians. When I say victory over communism, I mean exactly that. Wherever the communists choose to advance by overt military force, whether that force manifests itself in the form of a Berlin blockade or a Vietnam guerrilla war of so-called national liberation, no matter what form it takes, it must be destroyed immediately by superior military force. And notice I didn't say checkmated, I said destroyed. International crime not only must be stopped, it must be punished. Now, of course, the question that rushes to mind at this point is, what about the danger of escalation? Ladies and gentlemen, the total objective of military warfare, once it breaks out, is to escalate it as rapidly as possible to beyond the endurance of the enemy so he'll quit fighting. Without escalation, the slaughter continues on and on with no end in sight, and in fact no goal worthy of the sacrifice. Come to the table, we say to the communist thugs. We mean you no harm. All we ask is that you stop killing people for a while, long enough for us to hold a conference to see if we can't negotiate something to you that you want. I wonder how many of you would be willing to give your lives for that. And yet, that is the goal for which we've asked over 1 million Americans in uniform to be willing to die if necessary. And I don't think it's worth a single drop of American blood. When you put a young man in uniform and ask him to face an enemy in mortal combat, you'd better give that boy every chance in the world to win so he can come home. And that, ladies and gentlemen, means escalation. In Southeast Asia, instead of fighting the communist forces on the ground in an exchange of manpower, we should have followed General MacArthur's proposal to take the war directly to the nerve centers of the enemy's home base using our superior air power. Fighting on the ground, man for man, against the limitless population reserves of communist Asia is just about the only way the United States possibly could lose a war. Destroy from the air the sources of supplies and leadership. Then the guerrilla fighting on the ground would soon wither to no more than a local police problem. When the enemy suddenly realizes that the cards are no longer stacked in his favor, that he no longer has privileged sanctuaries, and that he might even stand to lose something for starting a war, he'll come to that peace table so fast it'll make your head swim. And when he gets there, there's only one thing we discuss with him: his surrender terms, nothing else. Now, any serious plan for victory over communism must recognize the need to accept the help of all willing and trustworthy allies. Yet in Korea and again in Vietnam, the nationalist Chinese have begged us to accept over 500,000 of their well-trained, fully equipped, strongly motivated troops, either to fight alongside our boys or to replace them altogether. And we decline to accept. Why? Well, of course, it's not really so hard to understand when you recall the grand design. If the nationalist Chinese were ever allowed to get into what is basically their own battle against Red China, they just might get an uncontrollable urge to go home to the mainland. They might not stop when they got to the Yalu or the DMZ. In fact, they might even try to win, and that would ruin everything. But that is precisely my point. Instead of cowering and trembling in fear at the dreaded possibility of Red China coming into a war, we should hope and pray that the anti-communist Chinese and Koreans and Vietnamese would drag Red China into a war, screaming and kicking, and then by triggering internal revolts, liberate her people from the yoke of communist slavery once and for all. And we mustn't back away from this one bit if we're really serious about victory. For our goal must not be merely to keep the communists out of South Korea or South Vietnam. That isn't victory, that's containment. It must include removing the communists from North Korea, North Vietnam, Red China, Cuba, Eastern Europe, and from the very first captive nation, Russia itself. Just as we could not rest in World War II until every last vestige of Nazism was stamped out everywhere, for 10 times that reason, we can never hope today to have peace or security until every last communist regime is removed from the face of the earth. It's not that we want it that way. It's just that we have no other choice. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if this sounds risky, it's because it is. Let's not kid ourselves. The proposal I have just outlined is very risky business. The only thing more risky is the grand design we are now following. For if we continue on that course, we have no odds at all for our survival. Now, this doesn't mean that we have to invade all these countries with soldiers. And it certainly doesn't mean that we should go around dropping the bomb on everybody. And if you're thinking that this is what my proposal implies, then that's a pretty good indication that you're still thinking in terms of old-fashioned warfare. Now, it's true that occasionally, whenever the conditions seem ripe, the communists do resort to brute force and semi-military tactics to advance their cause. When this happens, then the contest clearly must be won with military means. But because of the very nature of communist strategy, these hotspots never have and never will be more than diversionary tactics to implement the larger strategy in the total war, which is predominantly non-military. Just as we are losing this war through non-military means, if we ever hope to win it, we'll have to do so through exactly those same non-military means. Let me give you a few quick examples of how this can be achieved. First of all, and the most obvious of all, we must stop all trade and aid to communist regimes. Let these so-called socialist paradises try to exist on their own unproductive and bureaucracy-bound systems for a change without being able to run to Uncle Sugar every time they're in trouble and see how long they'd last. I don't think that they'd last 2 years. Now, secondly, I propose that we recognize all communist regimes. Recognize them, that is, for what they are, our mortal enemies. And if we do that, then we withdraw diplomatic recognition from them, no longer invite their leaders to dine in the White House, and we send their espionage agents posing as diplomats packing from our shores. Now, our non-military strategy for victory over world communism must take into account that our strongest allies and our greatest army already is within the enemy camp. But these captive peoples behind the iron and bamboo curtains have learned the hard way that although American leaders talk a good line about world freedom, when the chips are down, they don't deliver the goods. You want to meet some bitter people? Talk to a few Hungarian refugees or some Cubans whose loved ones were abandoned at the Bay of Pigs. I'll never forget one conversation with a young Hungarian freedom fighter. He described how for months prior to the revolt, American radio transmitters in Europe had been beaming broadcasts into Hungary, encouraging the people to revolt and promising full support. Now, to men and women who are fighting for their lives, full support does not mean moral support and good wishes. It means guns and ammunition. And so when the revolt finally broke out, this young man told how sure he and his friends were that America would come to their help. After all, we promised. Each day, they'd radio a desperate plea to the free world for military supplies, particularly bazookas and hand grenades, something that would be effective against Soviet tanks that were then forming an iron ring around Budapest. And then they'd go to the airport and wait. Finally, on about the fourth day, an American transport plane circled the field for landing. And when they looked up and saw that big, beautiful American star on the side of the plane, he said they began to cry like babies, because at last the Americans had come through. When the plane landed, they were so anxious to find out what kind of weapons had been sent, they scrambled aboard and began to pry open the wooden crates with their bare hands. And do you know what they found? Powdered milk. They were stunned. They couldn't believe it. And then one of them got the idea that maybe the Americans had been clever enough to camouflage their shipment by hiding hand grenades or at least bullets inside the cans. And so they got a can opener and began desperately to open one can after another. But each was the same, powdered milk. Well, actually, it was disclosed later that at the same time we were declining to offer any real help to the Hungarian freedom fighters, our State Department sent a communique to communist Yugoslavia, and thus indirectly to the whole communist world, that made it clear we would not take any action to prevent the Soviets from putting down this revolt in Hungary. The message read as follows: the United States looks with disfavor upon governments unfriendly to the Soviet Union on the borders of the Soviet Union. And since Hungary lies on the border of the Soviet Union, with that assurance of non-intervention from the United States, the fate of the freedom fighters of Hungary was sealed. But returning to the young refugee telling the story, after describing the scene at the airport, he looked at me and he said, "When we needed your help, you chose instead to be friends with the Soviets. My people will never trust the United States again, or at least as long as the American flag flies over your embassy in Budapest, as a reminder to us that your ambassador of goodwill continues to exchange cordial greetings with our hated masters. On the day that you lower your flag and call home your ambassador, on that day, my people will fight again." And these are just about his exact words. I've had reason to reflect on that statement many times since, and I've come to the conclusion that if the captive peoples behind the iron and bamboo curtains were ever given any reason to believe that we were really on their side, instead of seeking an accommodation with their masters, it's my conviction that they would take courage, rise up as one, and topple their communist regimes the same way they were imposed in the first place, from the inside, and we wouldn't have to fire a shot. But we do have to stop helping the communists. We do have to stop dignifying their leaders as legitimate representatives of the people. And we do have to stand firm for a change and declare openly in word and deed our uncompromising dedication to victory over communism everywhere in the world. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that probably would be an easy place for me to end. 3 cheers for victory. But it's not quite that simple. I'd be less than honest with you if I closed it at this point, because we still are missing one final but very important consideration. Even though it's true that the bomb is primarily a psychological weapon today, and even though the chances are microscopically small that the bomb would be used in either our victory or our defeat, nevertheless, we can't entirely rule out the possibility. No matter how remote, it still exists. So now what is our position? Do we give up the whole idea and return blindly to the hope that somehow we can coexist, at least for a little while longer, so we can enjoy life to the fullest in the time we have left? I think not. I have too much faith in the American people once they fully understand what the choice is. Putting it very bluntly, ladies and gentlemen, if we are not willing to risk our lives, our beautiful cities, and all the material things which we value for those principles in which we believe, then how can we have the audacity to send our sons into a foreign battlefield and ask them to give their lives for those principles? Are their lives any less precious than ours? As far as I'm concerned, when we send that first American soldier into battle, when we first ask him to be willing to lay down his life for us, we put the whole nation right on the line behind him. And if we are not willing to do this, then this is no longer the home of the brave, nor much longer the land of the free. Well, these are the heavy thoughts I leave with you. And I don't know quite how to close this presentation without running the risk of sounding corny, because the sentiment I want to express here has often been ridiculed as being corny. But to me, it's far from that. It's an article of faith that needs to be reaffirmed in the public mind openly, without shame or embarrassment. And it's simply this: as Americans today, we are truly a privileged people in a privileged land. But with our blessings come responsibilities, and with responsibilities come risks. The challenge of our time is that we must accept both the responsibilities of our blessings and the risks involved in defending them for ourselves and for future generations. And we must do this without hesitation if we are to be worthy benefactors of that precious heritage of freedom passed on to us through the epic sacrifices of those who have gone before. Now, that is not flag-waving, and it is not cliched patriotism. That's a simple statement of the obligations of citizenship in this glorious land, our land, which with God's help we shall preserve.